Welcome to the Using the Whole Whale podcast, where we learn from leaders about new ideas and digital strategies making a difference in the social impact world. This podcast is a proud production of Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's go learn something.
This week on the Nonprofit News Feed, we're talking about how a bit of controversy was created by Amnesty International's report on Ukraine. We'll get into that in a bit. First, Nick, how's it going?
It's going good, George. How are you?
Well, I'm excited. We've been hiring a bunch of people at Whole Whale. I'm coming back from vacation, got to see New York, got to hang out with you in actual Brooklyn. So that's always fun. I feel like we get to meet in person twice a year.
It was super fun. It's great to see everybody. But to your point, we do have a big story to start us off with. And this is one that developed over the weekend. And it's kind of a complex one, but I think it's worth unpacking. So the overview is that Amnesty International has triggered something of a global criticism for a problematic report lacking vital context that it published. So Amnesty published this report as part of its ongoing reporting on the war in Ukraine, but the report itself has been criticized for lacking critical context, framing, and has managed to trigger both internal and external condemnation. So the report specifically criticizes the Ukrainian military for violating international humanitarian law by putting civilians in harm's way in relation to where the Ukrainian military places defensive military equipment. So while Amnesty and other international NGOs pride themselves on remaining neutral and evaluating humanitarian and legal violations, which I think is important, this report in particular seems to just have been poorly framed from the onset. It was criticized for giving ammunition to Russian propaganda, misrepresenting the legal norms via kind of vague language. And they actually sidelined their own Ukraine-based office in its publication. That Ukraine office was protesting its release. After all this criticism, the Secretary General of Amnesty actually tweeted out that all this criticism is just propaganda without really taking into account that a lot of that criticism was coming from its own staff. And actually, the director of Amnesty's Ukraine office resigned in protest based on the criticism of this report. I think the takeaway here is that large nonprofits, Amnesty is a ginormous organization with offices in many, many countries, but it's really important to recognize the damage that can come from the public fallout of a misalignment between a global, where for American nonprofits, a national organization, and then more local, regional, or affiliate offices. And regardless of what you think about the report, there probably is a kernel of truth in it. It's really important, right, for nonprofits to play the role of kind of objective observers in this situation. But the problem is the rollout really just didn't take into account a lot of the context in which they were publishing the report. It was immediately blasted all over Russian state media, Russian propaganda. It was a gift to the Russians, and was widely criticized. And that internal and that condemnation by the Secretary General, I thought, was really inappropriate and just not useful or constructive. So George, what's your takeaway on this kind of debacle, which is playing out really, really publicly and has really, really important implications?
Timing is everything. And to the kernel of truth, I encourage you to not just blindly get angry at this without reading. You should read this report end to end, because on the surface, here was my initial gut reaction, was guess what endangers civilians? I don't know, firing missiles into cities and taking over a country through violent force. That's the big issue. And it's sort of saying, it's a drop in the ocean. It's such a tiny point to the macro injustice going on that, you're criticizing a country defending and fighting for its life while not really in this like one line saying, one line in here, such violations in no way justify Russia's indiscriminate attacks, which have killed and injured countless civilians. Okay. And then you're arguing that they parked their military base too close 5 times instead of wooded areas next to potentially schools and hospitals. You're like, yeah, those things seem bad, but it's like lacking, I think, to that point, the context. If the goal of this communication was to keep civilians safe, I wonder if this achieved it. I wonder if giving as a nonprofit their stamp, brand, message, nationally, internationally, a strong narrative of how Ukrainian troops in this case might be putting civilians in danger without the context of, again, the countless people that are being killed, and not to mention relocated and never seen from again in Russia. Does that make people safer? And so I think it's a good reminder, especially when you're putting out reports like this, what is the object of this report? Could this have been brought to Zelensky? Could this have been brought to American officials saying like, hey, the next time we drop another billion of weaponry, can we make the following recommendations to keep civilians safe? Because doing this helps Russian propaganda, which helps their campaign to take over the entire country by violent, bloody force. This is a high fail, but important to read. They betrayed the purpose of the communication, in my opinion.
Yeah, George, I completely agree with you. And it's really interesting to see. I recently, just as an aside, signed up for Twitter, which is something that I had put off for 10 years.
You tweet now?
It would be too entrenched. I don't tweet, God. I lurk.
Love it.
But I'll say this, it's really interesting to see lots of Ukrainian civilians criticizing this report. And just like to know that there's like these report impacts real people. And I think there's just frustration that you have this kind of global NGO with this kind of like academic legal mindset that is issuing a report sidelining the people of that organization, even in the country, right? It's kind of, it feeds into this narrative of like the out of touch, elite in London, New York, whatever. I think it's really important to be understanding of that mindset. But it's interesting to see those local stories and narratives on Twitter, which is like a decentralized flow of information in a way. And to your point, like make no mistake, we haven't really talked about the conflict in a while because it's a little bit outside the purview of what we try to bring our readers. But what's happening in Ukraine now is a genocide. The Russians are trying to eliminate what it means to be Ukrainian. And yeah, an important story to follow. And I think a cautionary tale for larger nonprofit.
Yeah, and they do put a caveat at the end. It's hard to tell what they've been adding to this. I can't see the track changes of what's going on and how it's landed. It does end with, condemning indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces. But it's just anecdotal, 3 statements by my count of individuals saying like, yeah, my son was killed because he was bringing food to troops. My people were put in danger here because there was a military objective over there. Like, the counterfactual is not there. Like, let's just be clear. When you roll in guns ablazing into a populated area, as Russia is doing, it doesn't matter where you put your munitions in your army. Like, this is just a moment where even civilians, every single male has been essentially, as I understand it, conscripted into the fighting force. Guess what? Those men live places, and it's called cities, densely populated cities, like Orflaw.
Yeah, I agree. This is interesting. We'll see how this plays out. But I think if for listeners who don't run large international human rights NGOs, I still think the takeaway here though is make sure that you and your own staff are on the same page before you release public statements of this level of importance, right? That was playing out really messily in a public way on social media. So even from a PR perspective, I think really important to kind of heed this as a cautionary tale. George, should we move on to our next story?
Yeah, because I could just rant further and further about how, guess what? Now Russia can use this as a banner every time they attack a school or hospital, being like, no, see, Amnesty International said they're using it as a military base. We can attack indiscriminately. It has betrayed the purpose and hasn't talked to the people on the ground as defined by the person, the head of the head of the Ukraine Amnesty International group resigning. You didn't even talk to your own people on the ground. I hope they got a big something for this because I don't see it.
Yeah.
Anyway, onward. I'm done with the rants. Mostly, we're done with the rants.
Done with the rants.
What do we got? Let's aggressive switch gears.
Forward and onward. This one comes from Not Pro, and it talks about the PIR, Public Interest Registry, which is the organization that manages the .org domain infrastructure, has announced a new .org family of domains that includes .charity, .foundation, and .gives. That comes on top of some other ones, including .ngo. This is really cool. And it goes into how organizations, any organization operating in social impact, can use these specific social impact oriented domains to better market what they are doing, right? Maybe your donation campaign is the .gives, or your foundation is a .foundation, or your large international human rights NGO could be .ngo. This is kind of cool. And I think shows a little bit of innovation in this space, and helpfully allows organizations to kind of better position themselves for their digital objectives, at least.
Yeah, the last time we were talking about PIR, they were talking about the potential sale of .org. But again, the purchase of a .org doesn't require that you have a 501c3. It doesn't require anything else that you have a credit card. Let's just be clear. And in order to give that sort of verified confidence that you are who you say you are and have that stamp, things like .gov, it's very clear that that is a government. Government sites, .govs, can only have .gov if you are verified as an entity of the government. Similarly, .edu, you must be an educational institution verifiable and under law to get a .edu. You do not need any verification validation for .org. And unless I'm missing something, it seems like all of these as well, there's no verification necessary for a .charity or a .foundation. It's simply another option to have as a brand. Is that what, I mean, from the article I've read so far?
Yeah, those are important things to call out. And it is crazy to think that this time last year we were talking about the sale of .org. But I think an important thing for nonprofits to stay on top of. And in my mind, I immediately went to the use in like a microsite, and why that could potentially be useful for branding. We don't actually often recommend microsites at Whole Whale, but yeah, I think you bring up some good points.
Yeah, as a reminder, you have a subdomain, so your nonprofit.org, anything you put prior to that instead of www can be used for infinity number of domains that you'd want to put in front of that. That would probably be my recommendation before going out and feeling like you need to do domain defense. But, talk to your digital strategist to decide whether or not, they're rolling that out 2022, officially to everybody in 2023, whether or not you feel like you'll need to be doing, domain defense, for instance, for .foundation or whatever it may be that is aligned with your organization. So, more domains to defend against.
That is true. George, maybe we can buy gatesfoundation.foundation and flip it.
Yeah, I'd go gates.foundation. I would go buy gates.foundation.
Gates.foundation.
Well, yeah, you want to be, I really think there's a great look to being a social impact domain troll. I think it really, it fits with our brand, or maybe not.
It's maybe we'll talk about this and not public.
Cut that,
right?
cut that.
No, we're joking, of course. Shall I take us into our next story?
Yeah, what do we got?
We got, this comes from yourvalley.net, and it's about, but I've seen this story elsewhere, but about nonprofits launching $100 million plan to support local health workers. So this is a really sizable initiative funded by the Skoll Foundation and the Johnson & Johnson Foundation, which announced on Monday that they've donated a total of $25 million to this new initiative and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which will oversee and administer the project, has matched the donation and is looking to raise an additional $50 million. So the investment here is attempting to empower frontline workers that experts say are essential to battling outbreaks of COVID-19, Ebola, and HIV. And just kind of this falls under the umbrella of treating neglected tropical diseases in Africa in particular. But just, I think we wanted to call this out. We don't often report on just kind of, numbers and money and donations, but this is a really sizable one, and it's going to health initiatives in Africa along diseases that, quite frankly, have global implications. So, George, why did you include this story?
I think it's so important to look at the last mile when you talk about lower resourced regions, under-resourced countries for certainly health and vaccine rollouts. It's a last mile problem. How do you get vaccines that may be in abundance, resources that are available to the last mile? And it's frontline workers. It is health workers that do this. And so it is just as important to developing the vaccine as to distributing it, and it's the people. And I like seeing a number this large of 100 million in 10 countries. By 2030 is, a long way out, but it's looking at the long view that we're going to be living with an additional COVID and other, hopefully not many more nationwide pandemics or health initiatives that are going to require these frontline workers, the last mile, to be supported. And, this is, the type of money I like seeing deployed in the right way, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. And we'll look to see, I'm interested to see kind of the efficacy of this, see the results, and we'll follow this project.
I'll also pull back and say, why bring this up? And another reason is because I think we, as nonprofits, or your nonprofit, if you think about it, who is the person in charge of distributing that last mile? And is there a way to increase your impact and also potential to fundraise by bringing that story to life? Are there people that deliver, that give information, that are in the office, that are in the field, that work with other folks that get that last mile? Is there a way to, frankly, brand, package, promote, and get funded extra money for that type of distribution? Because that's the level that I think we're in, and it seems like major philanthropies, Skoll Foundation, Johnson & Johnson, are paying attention to this. So just a thought for areas of narratives, of funding potential, and an increasing impact.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, I'll take us into our next story. And this one comes from OpenSecrets.org, which is a favorite of ours, a great repository for data on spending in politics, philanthropy, charity, advocacy, and in this case, lobbying. So the story from OpenSecrets is that Planned Parenthood Action Fund has set a new second quarter lobbying record amid the fallout of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. So this Planned Parenthood Action Fund is the lobbying arm of Planned Parenthood, and they spent more money than they had ever spent in a single quarter in Q2 of this year, spending over $569,000 on lobbying in just 3 months. And I don't think this is surprising. Like, there's a lot of work to do, a lot of political work to do. But I mean, this was something that we immediately knew was going to happen. There would be a ton of political jockeying, lobbying, and advocacy that was going to be kind of initiated once this ruling came out. And on the flip side of this, it actually talked about a slight decrease in lobbying spending from some anti-pro-choice organizations, including the Susan B. Anthony Fund, which is kind of interesting, I think, but something to watch. And sometimes spending on lobbying can be an indication of where these organizations' priorities are, and an indication of issues that really matter right now. So, George, what's your takeaway on this?
Lobbying by the C4 arm of Planned Parenthood is, unprecedentedly high, it looks like, going up, and it's going to change what actual politicians locally have to deal with, which is listening to the majority of the population as opposed to being handed a verdict by a small body of people that were politically elected to the Supreme Court. And now this is what we've been talking about, watching it play out on the ground. And it's going to be interesting. We actually just put together an article about what is allowed for 501c3s and C4s, mainly C3s, with regard to political activities and lobbying. And it's nuanced, actually, with regard to lobbying. And the narrative is that you can do some insubstantial activities related to lobbying, which is, issue-based. The candidate-based things, and you cannot do, certainly, because you will get flagged and banned as a certified 501c3. But I think there's going to be a lot more folks paying attention to how they enter the world of local elections, get out the vote, messaging around this topic, because now it is, and we're going to get seemingly weekly, monthly, state-by-state votes on, right now, what looks like ways to restrict women's rights in certain areas and ways to expand and codify into state law, state legislation, women's rights for, their own bodies.
Yeah, George, I think that's a great point. You already see so much action around this, right? Last week, Kansas had a referendum vote. Actually, legislators there were attempting to implement a near complete ban on abortion, and actually the citizens of Kansas turned out in quite frankly unprecedented turnout and voted against that ban. But the amount of money that poured into just Kansas there to mobilize voters and spread information about this campaign on both sides was a tremendous amount. This never happens on like vote initiative measures like this. So definitely something to watch going into the end of year. And to your point, I think this is one of the rare issues where actual legislation so obviously impacts actual people in extremely immediate and direct ways. And it impacts healthcare and health access and the lives of, more than 50% of the population, but probably really 100% of the American population. So definitely something to watch over the next couple months as this continues to play out.
Yeah, well, good to see Planned Parenthood putting the dollars to work, because that's where they need you to work right now. What do you have on feel good stories for us, Nick?
All right, George, this comes from CBS 47, but also Fox 30, that brands itself as Action News Jax. And I don't have much more to say about that, but coming from Jacksonville, Florida, this is about a nonprofit that's launched a national pickleball day to make a difference in their community. So Pickleball 101 Youth Clinic is being hosted on a Saturday, August 6th, which actually already happened. So celebrating what I'm sure was an amazing event. But the organization believes it'll bring increased awareness to the game of pickleball and its ability to bring together people of diverse backgrounds and abilities. This is something I don't know that we talk about maybe enough, but just the role of community organizations, community sports, and other type community activities that create those bonds and relationships that have really meaningful impact on people's lives. And those are often nonprofit civic organizations. So just wanted to highlight this story.
If this seems random to you, here's the reason I wanted to pull this out. Go to Google Trends and look at pickleball. Pickleball is the fastest outdoor sport growing, especially for the rising generation. So what's happening here is a brilliant tie-in to a nonprofit and cause to a rising activity and tying into that search. So go ahead and do that. So if you've never even heard the term pickleball, look at it as an opportunity to say, hey, what is a rising trend, has to do with activity? It could have been an exercise group or a social group. It doesn't really matter, but use these macro trends for good. I love it. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, George.
This has been Using the Whole Whale podcast. If you want to keep learning more about these topics and others, head on over to wholewhale.com/university to keep learning with us. Thanks as always to GregThomasMusic.org for his tunes that underwrite our tracks. They're fantastic. Hope you're doing well, Greg. And just a reminder, subscribes really help us on any platform that you listen to us on. Please give a thought to click and subscribe, and maybe even a comment, because we like hearing from you.